Welcome back to the Nourished Home YouTube channel. Thank you all for spending the day with me today. We're gonna go through a day of homemade, slow, yet simple cooking. One thing I have been really focusing on lately is how far we've strayed from our ancestral roots, not only in the kitchen, but in the home and just in our lifestyle and society in general. So before I start my day, I love to make something called bulletproof coffee, which is typically butter, some MCT oil, and then for added protein, I do add half a scoop of animal-based protein to my coffee. But back to my day of slow cooking. We had a long day this day, so I had to start early, which is good for slow cooking, especially a Ragu meat sauce like the one I'm prepping here. The longer it slow cooks and the flavors just melt together, it's just a really delicious. You can whip up tomato sauce rather quickly. That's also an option, in the weeknights and when time is of the essence. But on a weekend, especially as we're moving into the fall season, I've been more in the mood for those heartier, kind of slow cooked meals. And one way, to bring ancestral cooking back into the home, it's not as ambiguous as maybe it seems. I mean, to start, the base of ancestral cooking is just using whole foods, things that were around centuries ago. That's a great start, right? So limiting processed or pre-made foods. It's simple. Buying whole foods, cooking with whole foods, that's essentially step one. We do our best to source these things, as clean and as healthy as we can. But that's the key, just doing our best. I know health has been a huge focus, especially this year. I'm not sure if it's, we're coming out of sort of the COVID cocoon, and I know there's been a lot of focus in politics on health, and the pendulum is swinging, I would say, to more health-centered approaches and people really taking the health of their families into their own hands by cooking homemade meals more, or being more intentional about sourcing their foods and maybe trying to limit processed foods. And so yeah, that's been a pillar in our home for a while, but like I said, we're being much more intentional now than we've ever been, and we've seen drastic effects, not only on our health, but on the home in general, in terms of how things are organized, how our systems operate. And so when I preach and really feel passionate that nourishing the entire home of body, mind, and spirit starts in the kitchen, we've seen firsthand just how that is the truth for us, at least. Back to ancestral cooking, in addition to whole foods, another huge factor that we again have been missing for probably a generation or is the ancestral food preparation. When industrial revolution and all that kind of comes into play in our history, we're having 2-income households, so homemakers are not at home all day, able to have these foods slow prepping and fermenting and simmering all day. I get it. So if that's you and in a 9 to 5 is your reality, and maybe these methods will not work during the week, try it on the weekend or if you have a day off, because not only will you feel really that you're making a difference to your family with what you're serving them, but you'll see that you're gonna feel more nourished down to the cellular level, without added chemicals and preservatives and whatnot that are often in commercial foods. You really do feel differently. Your family will feel differently. You won't just feel the physical effects of it. You'll feel more mentally clear and more satisfied. That's something we've really noticed during our, back to our ancestral roots approach to nourishing our home. And so I'm just whipping up some sourdough einkorn pasta here that did ferment all day. I have never made a sourdough pasta before. This was my first time. Growing up, we would make homemade macaroni on holidays. Now, it wasn't sourdough, but it was just flour, salt, and water. And so, this isn't too far off from my upbringing, but I understand that for others, it might feel very foreign to make a pasta from scratch or even start a sourdough starter. And that was new for me too. My grandparents used sourdough back in Sicily, before they immigrated to the US. So as a kid, when my grandpa and my grandma and even my parents would make bread, once a month, big batches of bread, they were using commercial yeast. And so it just comes to show that it's very easy and it's very quick how ancestral practices, even in our own families, can get left behind because of convenience or marketing or whatever theory one might have as to why we have kind of abandoned these practices. I certainly have my own theories that I might get into one day, but in my adulthood, I have found value in talking to my parents about their childhoods, especially my dad. He grew up in Sicily with the sourdough starter on the counter that his mother, my grandmother, would bake their breads and pastas with. He grew up on the raw milk straight from the source. Organic vegetables, they weren't marketed as organic because they just were. And so, in a way, it's not that far removed from my lineage if we're talking about purely a time scale. But the way that it feels very far away. And so one of my missions is to not let it slip so far away where it would be far too difficult to reintroduce or to bring back into the home. And I know that not everybody maybe has that philosophy or finds it doable or interesting, but I do. And like I said, we have just seen significant health benefits all around from bringing back these ancient practices into the home. So, like I said, start with whole foods. Can't go wrong there. If you don't have all day to whip up a pasta dough, let it ferment, let ragu simmer on the stove, then I get it, and there's no judgment. But like I said, you might find one day a week or even one day a month to start integrating more of ways to nourish your family and yourselves based on our roots as a people. As I mentioned, I do come from a family of Italian immigrants, and I was able to see some of the ancestral practices preserved. For example, the jars of sauce that I used to make the ragu, my dad and my grandfather just made those a couple weeks ago. So every August, especially growing up, it was sauce making time. We never really bought sauce from the store until a couple years ago when sourcing tomatoes was getting a little bit more complicated, but I'm really happy that this year they were able to get that done. So if you don't really know where to start when I say ancestral or traditional or cultural, maybe just start by, if you have a family member who is older, maybe asking them about how food was prepped in their homes when they were children, or if they heard any stories from their parents and grandparents. I do think preserving that cultural, traditional, ancestral piece is a way to re-anchor us in this very chaotic, fast-paced world that we are all a part of. So the recipe will be in the description, and I hope you all take the leap, prepare something that your grandparents would have enjoyed, and remember to nourish your body, honor your roots, and thrive naturally.